The Oversight Committee on State and Local Public Assistance Programs will come to order. Due to a conflict I'll need to go to another committee just for a few minutes as I have a bill that's coming out, and then I'll return. And so I apologize for that. Thank you for everyone's patience. And with that, the committee will go at ease. The committee will come back to order.
That's it.
Will the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Wolford,
Here.
Representatives Bruck. Present. Cara. Cerniglu. Here. Menser. Here. Chair Wolford, you have 4 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. Today, we'll be hearing testimony from the Office of the Auditor General on overpayment claims and processing. I want to thank all of you for being here and appreciate the great work that the Office of the Auditor General continues to do in assessing compliance with the law of effectiveness within the agencies, especially within the fourth fictitious branch of our government, the administrative state. Today, we will hear from Bryan Weiler, Audit Division Administrator, and Chad Monger, Principal Audit Reports Supervisor. We'll plan on discussing these reports today, and I apologize due to the delayed start due to my testifying at another committee. But it was about legislation to fix bridge card fraud, so I think that you'll all appreciate that as well. Hopefully we can get time for our members to get all questions in, and I'm sure that our members can follow up with your office should time run short. However, before I turn it over to you today, we've asked you to be here to discuss 2 reports of a series of 5 audits that you performed for UIA, or Unemployment Insurance Agency, during the COVID era. The first report was released in January 2023 and focuses on claims processing issues at the UIA. That report identifies an estimated total of more than $8 billion in overpayments that resulted in after some common sense failures and directives from senior leadership at the UIA. The UIA is run by Leo, which is run by the governor, Governor Whitmer, and that's what I find interesting, is that this amount is at the very least the waste of taxpayer dollars, as we've seen in these reports. Whether it's through the federal grant or pandemic unemployment assistance in this state received, or through the taxes of the employers paying to contribute to the UIA's trust fund, I want to thank you for your hard work that you did in digging into these finances, and I'm sure that this was not easy and took a lot of time. So the second report I've asked you to discuss today is the one released in December of 2023. That report identifies the UIA not assessing fraud penalties and overpayments, and not completing referrals or fraud investigations at all, and paying hundreds of millions of dollars to people who were not working prior to COVID and therefore not eligible, like the deceased, the incarcerated, long-term care facility residents, people under the age of 15, and people over the age of 80. People not working getting unemployment benefits. Once again, thank you for being here and indulging me, because we do have people that watch these committees and pay close attention to them. But some of them only watch for a few minutes before they go back to their lives and their jobs, earning money to be taxed and unfortunately wasted in many cases. So I think it's always important for us to get a strong opening. So please begin your presentation, and thank you again for being here today.
Thank you, Chair Wolford, and good morning to you and the rest of the committee. My name is Bryan Weiler, and I'm an Audit Division Administrator in the Auditor General's office, and with me is Chad Monger, who is an Audit Supervisor in our office. We appreciate you inviting us here to be here today to discuss, as you mentioned, the January and December of 2023 reports involving the Unemployment Insurance Agency's processing of claims and efforts to address the fraud during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Chairman, we've prepared about a 5 or 6 minute overview of these 2 reports and some background information. And with your permission, I'll continue. Sure. And Chad and I are happy to answer any questions that the committee, try to answer anyway, any questions that the committee may have at the completion of our prepared testimony. So between November 2021 and December of 23, our office issued 5 reports regarding UIA's operations at the onset, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Although there was some overlap in the timeframes for these audits and the population of claims that we selected our samples from for our audit testing, each of these 5 audits had uniquely different objectives. So the 2 reports, as you've mentioned, that we're here to discuss today focused on UIA's claims processing during the COVID-19 pandemic, and our December 23 report focused on their fraud and investigation activities. The issues noted in these reports are not mutually exclusive of each other. For example, in addition to the issues we noted in the December 2023 report, we also identified several internal control deficiencies in our January 23 report, which impacted UIA's overall fraud detection and prevention efforts. Several times in these series of reports, we have acknowledged the unprecedented circumstances that resulted from the global pandemic and the significant spike in unemployment claims and challenges that UIA encountered in standing up the CARES Act federal programs. Regarding the overpayments that occurred, we identify in several instances in these reports windows of opportunity UIA had at the time to address that have likely closed to varying degrees by now. It is important to note that not all overpayments were fraud, and we did not attempt to estimate the total fraud that occurred during the pandemic. However, as first noted on page 13 of our January 23 report, by May of 2020, UIA was aware of potentially significant exposure to fraud and contracted with Deloitte to lead a cybersecurity and forensics assessment, and Leo publicly released the resulting reports from Deloitte in November of 2020 and then December of 2021. Deloitte provided an estimate in its December 2021 report that UIA paid approximately $8.4 billion in fraudulent claims. We cite information from Deloitte's reports, including its fraud estimates, at times in our reports, and otherwise our work was independent of Deloitte's. So our audit period for the January 2023 report covered January 1 of 2020 through June 30th of 2022, and we completed our audit fieldwork in the summer of 2022. There were 3 objectives in this report. The first was to assess the effectiveness of UIA's efforts to process UIA claims in accordance with selected state and federal requirements during the COVID-19 pandemic. We concluded that UIA's efforts were not effective, and we reported 9 material and 3 reportable conditions in findings 1 through 12 of this under this objective, and then 2 observations as well. The issues in the findings included UIA not investigating potentially misleading or inaccurate information provided by the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA, claimants to identify overpayments or determine when those overpayments resulted from claimant misrepresentation and potentially missing the opportunity to investigate and identify billions of dollars in existing overpayments as potentially fraudulent. Not applying fraud controls at the onset of the pandemic, not ensuring claimants met eligibility criteria for PUA and other federal programs established under the CARES Act, and improvement opportunities for its PUA requalification, recertification, and overpayment waiver processes. The second objective was to assess the effectiveness of UIA's communications with UI claimants during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we concluded were not effective. We reported 1 material and 1 reportable condition under this objective related to issues involving UIA's unresponsiveness to claimant contacts and communications and its monitoring of call center staff. The third objective was simply to compile and provide information on UIA claims processed by UIA during COVID-19 and other relevant data, which we presented as supplemental information in Exhibits 1 through 11, which you would find on pages 69 through 79 of the report. A description of the information in each of these exhibits is on pages 67 and 68. UIA's preliminary responses to the 14 findings in this report indicate some level of agreement with all of them and varying degrees of corrective action implemented at the time that we issued the report. Our December of 2023 report on UIA's fraud and investigation activities covered the period, again, of January 1 of 2020 through December 31 of 2022. And there was one objective in this audit, and it was to assess the sufficiency of UIA's efforts to identify and investigate potential claimant fraud, to which we concluded UIA's efforts were not sufficient. We reported 2 material and 2 reportable conditions in findings 1 through 4. And the issues in these findings included UIA under calculating fraud penalties and the potential for upwards of $840 million in fraud penalties UIA had not assessed, UIA not attempting to identify individuals who filed imposter claims or referring the claims to law enforcement, and UIA paying claims for individuals who were incarcerated, deceased, residing in a long-term care facility, or above or below the typical working age. UIA's preliminary responses to these 4 findings indicated, again, some level of agreement with all of our recommendations and varying degrees of corrective action implemented at the time we issued the report. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our prepared overview of these reports, and Chad and I are happy to go into more detail on any of the specific findings in these reports or to try to answer any questions from the committee at this time.
Great, thank you. Question, how much was the total of overpayments that you found in your audit, and over what period of time frame was that?
So in the background section of the report, we kind of talk about how we estimated overpayments, and I wouldn't say we had a total value for the overpayments, but we had several different estimates based on our projections, and that was based on the certain eligibility criteria that we were looking for. So we tried to explain that a little bit in the background section. So there's overlapping estimates, and to add them on top of one another probably would give a misleading number. But I think at one time, at least for the pool claims, UIA had identified $10.2 billion in overpayments.
Thank you. Representative Cara?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that $10.2 billion in overpayments, can you compare that to the total amount of money that was given out in total payments to people that were not overpayments?
I think there was about $40 billion that
40?
went out.
So about 25% of the money that went out were overpayments.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Menser?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if you were able to identify how much of this overpayment was due to employee failures to properly follow UIA guidelines, and how much of it was due to maybe computer system failures?
We didn't reach the conclusion that any of the errors were due to problems with Midas, other than how Midas was programmed. And we mentioned that in a few different instances where we thought the programming was critical, especially for the pool overpayments, to try to identify if they were overpayments related to fraud or overpayments related to some other type of issue, whether it's the employee making a mistake on an application or simply following what the application asked for at the time, and then later being determined to be an overpayment because they were not in fact eligible. So it was a variety of circumstances, but we did not reach a conclusion. We didn't find any evidence that these were system problems.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it safe to say that UIA scaled back the fraud and investigation activities during the COVID era?
Yes, it is safe to say that, and I think that's in line with what a lot of states were doing. And you know, I know we're not here to talk about other states, and nor did we really look at a lot of them. But at the time, the guidance from OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, was to expedite these payments. I know that UIA mentioned, and we included in the report, they were under a lot of pressure to expedite these payments. And one of the things that the then director considered was a tool that is called Fraud Manager that UIA uses to pre-screen claims as they come in and to turn off basically all elements of that to not slow down the payments.
And so whose decision is it ultimately on making those? I mean, you have the UIA director, but was it Mr. Gray who did it, or was it somebody above him? Could it have come from the governor's office? Do we know who up the scale was the one who was the decision maker in this?
Ultimately, I don't know. I mean, we saw, and I think we include in finding 2 reference to email communications that occurred. Obviously, it's something of that magnitude. The executive office was involved. To what extent, we don't know. Ultimately, it was Director Gray who made the call, and clearly, as we reported in finding 2, there were staff in UA who disagreed at times with.
But they were having communications directly with the governor's office?
We saw reference to possible communications with the executive office. We did not see any direction or emails from the executive office.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. What does Fraud Manager screen for?
I think it screens for a variety of items that they would flag for potential impropriety, such as, and I think we list some examples in finding 2 of this report, but they're looking for, an easy example is somebody who's out of state, an out-of-state address, or they look for certain bank accounts, IP addresses, their physical address, as I mentioned. Those are some of the easy things, and there's probably other things that they would consider proprietary that they're looking for, but it's a pre-screening tool that basically could ferret out a lot of the intentional or the identity theft. Sorry. Thank you.
Representative Bruck?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. Before I ask my question, I was going to ask, on that fraud manager, when it was shut off, was it, in your report, did you find that, was it kicking too many out? Was that the kicking too many claims back is why they shut it off?
It was shut off before they started processing the PUA claims, in anticipation that it would erroneously flag or slow down, I believe, the claims as they came through. So then it was not turned back on for some time after, but it was off at the onset.
What was the date when it was actually shut off then?
I know that's in here. Do you have that?
April 13th, 2020. Which the PUA claims started to be processed. I think the application went live in April 20th of 2020. So there was some normal UI claims that going out prior to that, but the actual PUA claims started to be paid around April 20 of 2020.
Okay, so on that list, Exhibit 11 is what I was looking at. Like you have the numbers, normal numbers, and then April of 2020, almost 3.5 million claims. So essentially, even before those claims hit, that fraud mitigation method was shut off. That
Correct.
program was shut off. Okay, thank you.
Representative, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I had my original question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Excuse me. And thank you. As far as the triggering, I appreciate Representative Menser's question on what was it a program issue or was it human issue? And it sounds like it was human issue. And I'm a business owner, so I can tell a little example. Obviously, mail was not going out very quickly in 2020, especially once the pandemic and the USPS and everything got slowed down. And we received a number of claims well after the period to attest or that claim. And we made lots of calls, and we had one individual that had actually checked quit on her claim and still got paid. And when I called and spoke, I spent hours on the phone talking to different individuals, and talked to an individual that said, yes, that was denied initially, but then it was overridden by her supervisor and passed through. But there was nothing I could do, no recourse, because we were past the time and it was already paid out. And, I argued quite vehemently, because that increases my rates. Essentially, in the end, it did. They said it wouldn't, but it did. But that was a human error. So I appreciate Representative Menser's question in that fact that it should have been triggered. Something like that would have been triggered by that fraud detection, or, not necessarily fraud, but sometimes it's just inadvertent, I don't want to say errors, but it's disqualifiers, correct?
Sure. Yeah, intentional misrepresentation can be fraudulent or not. charges.
Yeah, not everyone that got payments was intentionally trying to defraud the government.
Right.
In my case, a particular employee checked quit, which would have normally disqualified her for UIA. But it was overridden by humans, not machines.
We have similar instances of that in the report with, in finding 2, on part B, we talk about the 10-day hold that was removed. That was in place on regular claims to, in that instance, if one of your employees would have filed a claim, you would have, as a business owner, 10 days to attest that. And that was turned off as part of the controls. And then on in observation 2, we mentioned a couple of our sample items. We noted instances of that where protests came in timely, but they weren't addressed by UAA, which led to overpayments of $33,000 and $43,000 in 2 cases that we saw. So I think we saw similar issues of that.
Yeah, it's pretty rampant then, certainly. On the review, on a normal review, what triggers a normal review? Like what, that fraud pretension, what are items? You had mentioned addresses. You had mentioned out-of-state bank accounts or something.
Yeah, I think there's several indicators they look at with Fraud Manager to stop payment or prevent payment from occurring. And then they also have a process to flag claims after they've been paid and stop payment and assess non-monetary issues that they'll follow up on.
But every one of those systems were shut off.
For certain types of claims, yes. The pool of claims in particular, and that's finding 1 in the claims report, there was never Midas was not programmed for them to be able to identify intentional misrepresentation on a pool claim. And item B of that finding 1 says that they were Midas was programmed to automatically adjudicate and close any claim flagged for intentional misrep on any of the pool claims. So, and again, I believe that was in an effort to, and in belief that there couldn't be fraud on these pool claims because everybody was eligible in the eyes of some of the folks making the decisions. But there was every effort made to keep the payments.
And this report was given with the prior director. We did meet the current director. I'm assuming this was prior to him because I think it was just a couple months ago he became director. There's a number of, my last question, I've seen a number of these reports for other things, but there seems to be an awful lot of partially agrees instead of agree or disagree, but there's a lot of partial agreements. Can you describe the background on some of those? Because some of these seem pretty obvious, like it was a jacked up situation. There was lots of funding, and they partially agree. What exactly does partially agree mean?
Well, I think in some instances, the agency agreed that with the recommendation that they make sure claimants are eligible, that they make sure they do some of the things they're required to do. I think they disagreed with some of the finding, the elements of the finding. And we tried to address some of those disagreements in the back of the report, and given the length of their responses and our then comments to address them, we put it in the back. But I think that was, at the time anyway, the gist of the partial agreements. And honestly, at times, the partial agreements, it read more to us like they agreed, but it's their words, and we include them in the report as partial agreement. They certainly agreed corrective action was necessary, sometimes disagreed with how we characterized the facts in the finding.
And that was a previous director as well.
Yeah, there's actually been 4 directors now, including the most current, since we started these endeavors.
In the back of the report, as you mentioned, in the findings, we mentioned a very brief summary of the response, but the full response starting on page 80 for many of the findings when the response from the agency was lengthy or we need to respond, we put the full response back there. So there is more than just partially agree in the agency's words, so you can see those in the back of the report with a lot more detail and our response when needed.
Representative Cara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a time frame in which the UIA can recover some of this overpayment that went out?
Yeah, there is actually. We cite in a few of these findings reference to the MES Act that talks about redeterminations and going after fraudulent payments. So for intentional misrepresentation, a redetermination has to be made within 3 years. For identity theft, it's more than 3 years, but there is a statute of limitations on that the federal government was looking to expand. I don't know if that's happened, but I think it was 5 years. They were looking to expand it to 10.
So in a lot of these circumstances with the past, it's already past 3 years, so it's past that point for a lot of these circumstances. I don't know how much the Oversight did in the last couple of years to look into this. Are you aware?
I'm not aware. This is the first we've been asked to come over. So
Okay,
I'm
well, I
not
appreciate you
aware.
guys being here. Yes, thank you. It's good information.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. With, as we talked about, a potential 8 to 10 billion in overpayments paid while UIA used basically a bad website and turned off the fraud manager or detector. Could you clarify what UIA did with the Midas program?
In relation to those overpayments in particular, the 10.2 billion,
Yes.
Chad can jump in here, but at the time, I don't believe, the biggest problem that I would say with Midas was the inability to identify, assess a non-monetary issue on these pool claims, and then do the normal investigative activities they would do to determine if an overpayment occurred, if it's something they need to pursue from a fraudulent viewpoint, or if it's something they eventually ended up issuing waivers to folks who hadn't done anything wrong. They just followed the application and were paid. But the inability to flag those claims correctly in Midas was a significant hindrance to them being able to go after the 10.2 billion in overpayments to determine what the circumstances were. But a large number of that, I think 5-point-something billion, was related to the incorrect eligibility criteria that UIA had included initially for the pool applications. And a large number of those folks were granted waivers who had selected one of those incorrect eligibility criteria. But there were, we had some concerns in finding four with the waiver process as well.
Thank you. And in finding two, did PUA money come from the same or different criteria than normal unemployment?
Well, it's 100% federal, the pool was.
Mm-hmm. And that was around 40 billion that came in.
I think a combination of the different federal programs totaled 40 billion. And I think
The 40 includes normal UI claims paid by state funds, but the vast majority, I think we do have a breakdown, was federal funding, which there's the normal UI claims, and then there's the PUA claims. There's a PEUC, which essentially is an extension of the normal UI claims. And then there's also what was an add-on payment, it's a PUC, which was, you've heard terms of like extra $600 added to claims. That was for a certain period of time, and then it turned off, and then they got added back on, I think starting in January 2021 for a while. So that the pool claims and the UI claims were around split around the middle, and then but those included the PUC add-on. So it's a combination of all those claims to get to the 40 billion.
Thank you. And who pays into those state funds?
Employers.
Employees.
Employers.
Employers. Employers. Okay, thank you. What did the UIA do with the application portal when the PUA money was given?
Well, in reference to how they stood up the application process in Midas, they needed to start from scratch on this brand new program. So that's what they did. They stood it up in 3 or 4 weeks, I believe. Got it out into Midas for folks to then be able to access and apply for the pool funds. And then there's been a series of iterations since the original standing up of the application to make revisions.
And then from your findings, what happened after UIA created their own application?
Well, there were some issues with the original application. There were a couple of things that were somewhat major. The inclusion of criteria that were not provided for in the CARES Act was a concern. And then for the initial several weeks of the application process, they didn't require a certification to be included. So, those were a couple of the big things that they needed to adjust as they went.
Okay, thank you. Representative Caro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In addition to scaling back their fraud and investigation activities, we have an atmosphere of self-attestation, meaning that they just say that they've been looking for work and that's sufficient. Do you believe that the self-attestation added to the possibility of fraudulent activity?
Yes, absolutely.
Just honor system, put the brownies out on the table, and hopefully they don't sneak taking one when you're not looking.
Well, I mean, this was a provision in the CARES Act, and it was a mandate that states allow for self-attestation for these, I wouldn't say irregular, but for the non-typical employee looking for unemployment who doesn't have a work history with an employer, for instance. So that was part of what states were mandated to stand up, was a self-attestation. And over time, the federal government would give updated guidance on, hey, okay, let's start looking at these a little closer, and made further provisions to ensure program integrity with this self-attestation. It wasn't mandated, but it was strongly encouraged through the guidance to ensure integrity by way of verifying employment, verifying their prior, work history. But those things evolved as the program matured a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
This self-attestation, or however you pronounce it, fancy for just saying that we believe whatever people are telling us. Trust me, I'm who I say I am. And we're seeing this across multiple committees, multiple government agencies. It fascinates me. Now for the question, I'd like to move to finding 4. I think it's very important that we talk about the waivers on overpayments. I know in this 4th finding identified issues with UIA granting waivers on overpayments. First, they granted a waiver on 1/3 of cases without reviewing the file first. Second, hundreds of millions was given to people prior and issued or who never requalified or recertified after the UIA's website issue. And then third, most of those waivers were for a quote-unquote agency error with the UIA's website. So what is supposed to be the criteria by which the UIA chooses to grant overpayment waivers?
I think in this case, there's provisions in the MES Act and provisions at the federal level for when waivers are appropriate for the agency to consider. And I think one of them is, I forget the language they use, but in good conscience. Basically, the applicant didn't really do anything wrong. They filled out an application. They were incorrectly determined to be eligible. They were paid. They're not held at fault. And that was the premise, I think, for what UIA was trying to accomplish in granting overpayment waivers. And the magnitude of these, I mean, this is a very large number of overpayment waivers, just because of the issue with the application up front where incorrect eligibility criteria were allowed. And basically, the federal government came in and said, you have to go back and make them recertify, requalify. So in doing that, that's where we come up with 5-point-something billion of the dollars paid were for folks who had selected those incorrect criteria. UIA's process was to kind of cast a pretty wide web to determine if they were eligible or not. And one of the main factors they considered was whether, if somebody didn't respond to their inquiry, they were granted a waiver. And there's significant risk that goes along with that, especially from a fraud consideration, given what we know now what I believe they knew at the time, considering the risks of fraud for this population of claims. So that is the main reason the waivers were granted, was holding the applicant not at fault for a mistake UIA had made. However, there are provisions in both of the federal regulations and the MES Act that prohibit a waiver in the event of claimant fraud. So given the number of known instances of identity theft and intentional misrepresentation that occurred, it's very likely that UIA was granting waivers to folks who had in fact committed fraud. And in fact, when you get to our next report, the Fraud and Investigations report, in our response to one of their comments, we point out that in fact some of the deceased and the folks who, somebody was applying for benefits on their behalf, obviously, and that was fraud. Some of those folks, as an example, there were several different categories of folks that was known fraud. They were granted waivers because of how the process was administered.
Thank you. Representative Menser?
Thank you, Chair. To kind of go back to my point before, I will admit to you that there are probably some staff that acted in bad faith. But what I'm looking at is hundreds of thousands of employees across the state of Michigan were all laid off basically in one week. When it was the shutdown was ordered. In my own employer, hundreds of us were laid off in 1 week. Some who had never collected unemployment before, who had no idea how to fill out the claims properly, who got no instruction in that. Then you have the overwhelming rush to collect benefits, and staff who are probably overwhelmed, undertrained, don't have the resources that they need, and a program failure of the fraudster system. So I think what you have is like an absolutely perfect storm of wrongly applied information. You want to comment on that, any?
I think we observed all of those things when we did these series of audits. It was very overwhelming. I think UIA was doing their best to keep their head above water. The first report we issued was on personnel management and trying to hire temp workers. So yeah, there was a lot of things that were overwhelming about the situation at that time. And but we try to focus on what's the internal control structure. How can UIA learn from the deficiencies that were exploited or brought to surface during these trying times. And that was the focus for us for most of these findings, was going forward, how can we prevent this next time or handle it better?
Thank you.
Isn't it true that UIA and LEO employees also got benefits during this time? And I believe that was in the audit.
Yes, we did find that.
So that's fascinating. Representative Cerniglu?
Thank you. So I think we were had some questions on self-attestation and seeking employment, and maybe I wasn't following properly, but wasn't the requirement to continue seeking employment actually waived during that time?
It was waived for a period of time, yes.
Thank you.
Representative Brook?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question, finding 9. So again, I appreciate all the questions that have been going on and responses. In the findings for 9, the responses, it's page 100. And it really bothers me that there's a note there. However, the UIA disagrees that established procedures were bypassed. Who makes that decision? How could they argue the fact that we've been discussing so far this whole committee on how things were bypassed or shut off? How can they make that statement?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. We did put a comment next to that particular claim with the same question.
I find that pretty audacious to do or say, and Brad and I had another question, and it just, when it comes to the state, so some of the discussion has been the overworking, and I find that fascinating that UIA employees were actually getting UIA benefits during this time. But out of all 50 states, we're the 5th highest payouts, according to your graph on page 71. And one of the highest for the PUA payouts, or PU payouts, however, from the federal government. And understandably, there was an overload. In your findings, obviously we've discussed that there were a lot of things bypassed, which probably created a lot, but 25% fraud, essentially, or fraudulent payments made, maybe not fraud, but fraudulent payments made. 25% of $40 billion was paid out it shouldn't have been paid out, period. When you did your research, and you're obviously looking at other states are going through the same pandemic we're going through. Why the difference here in Michigan?
I don't know if I can answer that directly, Representative. We know the circumstances in Michigan for some of these programs, the length of time, they all expired around the same time. There were certain factors that we point out in these findings, like we talk about the work search. And I think UIA was slow to reinstate the work search requirements by about 7 months. And that allowed for longer periods of time. And the certifying to being able and available for work, those were two things that we found to be significant factors in the length of time Michigan applicants were allowed to continue with their benefits.
I find that fascinating. I mean, you guys are the good guys here. I know that. I mean, you're just reporting what you found, and we truly appreciate you being here. And Representative Kara mentioned about, he had asked a question in that time, like the 3 and the 5 years. As I'm reading through this document, the UIA is responding in 2022 and 23. I mean, we're just getting it now in 2025. Because it takes such a long time this is a lot of work that you guys did, but why on earth hasn't the UIA been retracting all those fraudulent payments? I mean, they've been notified 21, 22, you're doing this report. And we're just finding out now, and we're told by the newest director, they're only looking back. I can't recall exactly his comment, but they're going back a year maybe or something was his comment. That seems to ring in my head. They're going back about a year, and I think there's just a massive amount of work to do there. But when you're doing this report, they could have went back. Is that the director? Why didn't that happen? Was that the director not taking action? Was it the executive branch not taking? I mean, I don't want to necessarily play the blame game, but obviously there was a great failure. You're identifying these issues, and no one's taking care of it. They're giving you responses, obviously, but no one is taking care of it. Why?
I just want to clarify. We issued the reports in January 23 and December 23. We are not aware of what's been going on since we issued these reports. So this may be new to the committee, but our reports were issued in January 23 and December of 23. That's the last time we were over there.
We have no knowledge of what their thought process has been since then, or what they may or may not have done to address the findings.
So, I mean, even if it's a late date of 2023, they still could have taken that. They're still within that three-year window to recoup billions of dollars of cost, and they did nothing, essentially, or very little.
Yeah, actually, I mean, we were intent on including those timeframes where applicable in the findings for that purpose, to raise that awareness that, hey, you're on the clock. But the decisions they made after that is in their wheelhouse.
I believe the director and his aide, I think they said it was about 300, I want to say million. Was it 300 million? It wasn't that much that they've recouped. I mean, that's peanuts compared to $10+ billion in bad payments. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Sure.
Thank you. Circling back, I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but circling back to Representative Cernoglu's question made me think of this. How did the suspension of those requirements line up with Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home orders, and was it longer or shorter?
I think they aligned initially, and Chad will know the details on this, but they aligned initially, at least for the able and available provision. And I think states were encouraged to remove some of those requirements to make sure these payments were processed. But I think once the governor started to lift some of those restrictions, I think UIA was a little slower in removing or reinstating some of those provisions. So I think the governor's lifting of the orders occurred months before UIA then revised some of the application information.
And in finding 9, we discussed the able and available requirement for work, which is a fundamental component of the UI program in general. Federal guidance in early 2020 clearly indicated that states could not waive this requirement. It was waived in the executive order in March 2020, and rescinded in April 2020. So that was essentially removed from the executive order very early on, but not added back to the application until much later. I want to say sometime in mid-2021.
Thank you. Representative Cara?
That's some fascinating information. Thank you. And it seems like the OAG has done a great job, multiple reports pointing towards problems that we saw with what was going on, what the UIA was doing, what Leo was doing, what the governor's office was doing to tackle some of these problems that they created. It seems that it's been very stagnant. Now finally, here we are in the legislature in 2025, starting to take this seriously from the legislative branch. But you guys have provided these reports to us. We've had it on the table for us to review, and I appreciate the work that the committee is taking in recent months now to look into this. I guess my question I want to ask is, with the concept of these employees who are working in bad faith, basically they were told to work in bad faith. They were told the whole atmosphere we had operating was we had them taking UIA claims themselves. So they were, in a time when we needed UIA to be ramped up to deal with this heavy workload, they weren't working as much as they could have. They were getting UIA claims themselves, the UIA employees. They were ramping down their fraudulent claims division, creating an atmosphere ripe for all of this fraud. I feel like the leaders in this multi-billion-dollar problem is the UIA and anybody up to the governor who is directing this. Does that make sense?
I appreciate your comments.
And it's not your fault. You guys are here reporting, uncovering the problems. Thank you for what you've done, and thank you to this committee for taking this problem seriously.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. When an overpayment is identified, does UIA send a letter to claimants requesting that they pay back the money or respond? And then also, generally speaking, what happened to the claimants that you identified who failed to respond to the UIA's letter?
Generally, yes, they have a protocol to reach back out and contact the claimants. Now, again, for the certain population of claims, a large population of claims, the pool of claims, that process didn't happen. Other than the redetermination efforts, because they had selected incorrect criteria, which most of them did not respond to.
So essentially, all overpayments are required to be paid back unless it receives a waiver. And if it's determined to be fraudulent, whether it's identity theft or intentional misrep, the amount is required to be paid back plus penalties and interest. But the only way that it would require to not be paid back is with those overpayment waivers.
Thank you. And then did someone get a waiver who just decided, I'm not going to respond? Did they get waivers?
In response to UI's efforts to require them to recertify or requalify, the lion's share of those applicants did not respond to their further inquiries or attempt to recertify or requalify. They were given waivers.
And what happened to the people who did respond?
They were given waivers also.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Menser.
Thank you once again, Chair. And to kind of piggyback off Representative Cara. So what I see here is several catastrophic failures or very poor decisions made at the management level. They failed to reinstate the work search right away. They turned off the fraudster, didn't turn it back on for months after when it should have been. The failure to recoup the incorrect payments, whether it was overpayment or, given incorrectly. And then I'm going to add proper staff oversight and training, and whether or not there was enough staff. So do you think that that's a fair assessment of what created this ungodly mess?
Yeah, I think all of those factors are relevant, and in fact, the finding on the benefit payment review speaks to the lack of training for staff who were required to look at some of these high-risk payments and just, were ill-equipped to do so.
Thank you.
Representative Cara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve Gray was the director of UIA when the COVID pandemic started, correct?
Correct.
And did he get a severance package when he left? Are you aware?
I'm not aware. I don't have any independent knowledge of that. Just what I've read.
Okay, and do you know if he signed a confidentiality agreement?
I do not know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Representative Bruck? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. On the trust fund or the banking system, and I was kind of looking through it, did you guys track that or give any oversight or reports on the trust fund amounts, or I should say the bank, sorry?
Yeah, not specifically. I think in some of the exhibits we present, you can see the normal UI payments, but I think there was a period of time, and Chad might know better, where the employers weren't required to be paying into the trust fund for a period of time during COVID. Is that?
I wonder,
Essentially,
6 months or something?
I believe they were still paying in, but these additional claims were called non-charging, I believe they called it. So where they still paid in the normal rate, but this was not adding to the burden, is what we were aware of. But so we didn't do a ton on these projects related to like the financial fund side. Our office contracts annually with contractors to do required audits of the UIA trust funds that are separate, that are available on our website, but we did not do those in particular.
Okay, and you didn't, because you've done 5 different reports just on the UIA, correct?
Correct.
But none of those really address the trust bank or trust fund.
That's correct. That's covered in the financial audit that, as Chad mentioned, is separate.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to talk about here in closing finding 3 of benefits to the incarcerated, deceased, or those in long-term care facilities, benefits to UIA LEO employees or contractors, benefits to people age 15 and under, or those 80 and older, basically benefits for everyone. In Part A of the 3rd finding, it identifies over $60 million in benefits paid from January 2020 to October 2022 to 3 specific groups of people. The incarcerated to the tune of $35.6 million, the deceased to the tune of $19.8 million, and those in long-term care facilities to the tune of $6.5 million. Also, let's move to Part B, which identifies over $5 million being paid to those who were either in UIA's payroll or LEO employees during COVID. Finally, we get to Part C that identifies people age 15 and under or over the age of 80 and or over who received unemployment benefits too. 80 years old and above that received benefits as well, to the tune of over $177 million. So I want to thank you for being here today, and I feel like we've probably got even more questions now than we did before we started about the UIA and what they were up to during COVID, like deactivating fraud controls prior to COVID money, even coming in at that time over $8 billion in likely fraud by the UIA's own self-audit through Deloitte. Is that how you say it? Deloitte. I can never get that right. I'm always thinking about his brownies or Werner's. But anyway, the overpayment of $8 billion, and then also the 4 directors during just this 3-year audit period. So thank you for being here today, and I would like to adopt the minutes of May 2022. There being,
I need a motion.
oh,
One of the, perfect, Brock.
Bruck makes a motion to accept the minutes of May 22nd meeting. There being no objections, the motion prevails by unanimous consent. And there being no further business, this meeting is now adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee. We appreciate the time.
Thank you.